you know, upwards of 500 bouquets of flower right in front of the synagogue. This is where the president will come. The road has been cleared. There were probably 200 to 300 people in front of the synagogue about an hour ago, and most of the morning there were people here chanting, singing, praying, young children, elderly people, everyone. I have to tell you, Tanya, I have been so impressed with the classiness of the people of Pittsburgh who have come here, grief-stricken, devastated, but yet so generous in just how they have treated everyone, the interactions that I have seen, right? There was a bit of a tense moment earlier. There was a man who lives in the area, originally from Russia. He has lived here in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood for about the last 40 years, and he brought a Make America Great Again sign. And he was standing actually just behind me, right here behind the barricade. And there was a man who was probably 10 feet away, and he yelled, "This is not a campaign rally," and show some sensitivity. And the man seemed unfazed. He held the sign, but we haven't seen, you know, there was talk of possible protest. We haven't seen any in this area. It has been very calm, very peaceful. Again, the Secret Service has moved in, awaiting the president's arrival.
Yeah, David, you know, I lived on Squirrel Hill there in Pittsburgh as a child. My parents were completing their graduate work at the University of Pittsburgh, so I have very, very fond memories of that area, and you're right. The people there are just lovely. It's heartbreaking to see what that community is going through now.
So classy, Tanya, and I have to tell you, there was a man who reached out to me on Instagram who lives in the area, and he said, "David, just promise me that when you tell the story of Squirrel Hill, you tell how much the sports and the hockey and the politics and the church is all intertwined in what we do," right? And I mention that because some of the Steelers players were actually at one of the funerals today. The Rosenthal brothers, Cecil and David, who were buried earlier today. Both brothers were intellectually disabled. And there was a lady who came, and she was at the funeral, and she said, "I wish you could have heard." The brother-in-law got up and was talking about David. Apparently David loved the police. And when you know, I have an aunt who's developmentally disabled, and sometimes even though they're adults, you know, they have the mentality of children, much younger than them. And there's a preciousness to them and their spirit, right? And that's what I'm told the Rosenthal brothers were like, and they were both here. There was also, Tanya, a photo that was released earlier today of the husband and wife who died inside the synagogue. They died in the same place where they were married.
Oh, God.
62 years ago, and today their children released a statement. And of course, I can't stop thinking about the 97-year-old lady who died. Shot in the back of the head, sitting in the chair where she was sitting, and shot while she was worshiping. And to live 97 years.
She's a Holocaust survivor, correct?
No, that is not correct.
That is not correct.
There was some misreporting about that, Tanya, initially early on, and we actually were trying to confirm it, but her family has since come out and said she was not a Holocaust survivor. But you know what? The fact that she wasn't a Holocaust survivor doesn't take anything away from how senseless her death was and how remarkable her life was.
Absolutely. I love hearing you say that the Pittsburgh Steelers have become involved in this community as it mourns, because you'd be hard-pressed to find a single person in Pittsburgh who's not a die-hard Steelers fan. So it's wonderful to hear that the sports teams there are getting involved. Did you attend any memorials or any services today, David?
No. Usually what happens when the president is coming on a visit like this, you kind of get corralled into an area, and if you leave, it's hard to get back into. So we have other crews who have been at the funerals today. But you know, when you go to something like that, Tanya, you want to be so respectful. Sometimes families say, "Hey, come in, shoot the funeral, record it, everything." We do know there will be at least one service that is private, not open to anybody. The other services we went to taking a respectful position, either outside or inside if we were invited. But no, I have been here. And more to your point about the Steelers and just sort of how sports is interwoven into everything here in this area, there was the man who's the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and he wrote an article, and he quoted an author who wrote a book about American Judaism, and that author wrote that the fabric of American Judaism is woven into Squirrel Hill. right? Squirrel Hill being one of the most diverse communities in the country, according to the mayor, the people who live here, the governor, and according to what I've been able to find out over the last 72 hours of being here. This area is so eclectic, so diverse, and also so welcoming. I've been struck by the people who were inside that synagogue who have come up to us to thank us for being here, to thank us for telling the stories, right? Survivors. And then I've been so moved by the stories that we've heard, not only of the heroic actions of the police officers, but the fact that the people who treated the gunman, and no need to name them, but the people who treated the gunman were Jewish.
I know.
Now remember that gunman.
And
that
he
gunman
kept
was
yelling
saying,
at them in the hospital.
in the ambulance, at the hospital, and here at the synagogue. And yet one of the emergency room doctors and one of the nurses were Jewish.
David, I also want to ask...
The grace that it takes to treat that man is incredible.
Incredible,
Anyway,
absolutely. I also want to ask you, we're looking at pictures of people that are gathering about, I guess, a half a mile from where you are right now. Many of them are holding signs that seem to be directed at the president, although it's unclear. What is your sense of how welcoming the crowd there is, or how pleased they are that the president is visiting?
So to that point, let me start with this. The mayor of the city of Pittsburgh is not expected to meet the president. We actually got a list of people who were going to be at the airport. It is customary for dignitaries to show up at the airport to meet the president. There was one person listed on the list of folks who were going to meet the president. That was notable. The mayor of Pittsburgh kind of signaled early on that he had no interest in meeting the president. But notably, the rabbi of this synagogue said within the last couple of days, hey, listen, the president is welcome to come here anytime. And there was a CNN report earlier today where the rabbi said, you know what, I'm too busy. I've gotten a lot of messages of hate since I made that statement, and so I don't expect to meet the president. I called the rabbi because I want to do some of our own reporting, and I got him on the phone. He had just left a funeral, and he said something kind of bizarre. He said, I can't answer that question because I don't have enough information to answer it. And I said, wait a minute, Rabbi, there's a report out that you said you were not going to go to meet the president. You said you would welcome the president to come anytime. What's the deal? And he kind of bizarrely said, I don't have enough information to answer your question. So that's the best answer I have for you right now.
I do want to tell you,
I'm not expecting that the rabbi will meet him.
David, we just saw two very large signs that folks were holding up there that said, Mr. President, you are not welcome here in Pittsburgh until you fully denounce white nationalism. I don't see it in front of me right now, so I'm sure that's not verbatim, but it was a very large sign, two of them, with words to that effect. Is that what you've been hearing as well?
Well, in fact, there is a rabbi of a left-leaning Jewish organization who did make it clear that the president should not be welcomed here until he denounces white nationalism. So yes, that has sort of been spreading. But I will tell you, there have been people who have come here today. A woman who I spoke to, an elderly woman, who said, listen, the president doesn't get a fair rap, right? She said something to me. She said, people don't get his style over his substance. She goes, I hate some of the things that he says, but I love some of the things that he does. Right? And that is some of the mood and emotion that I have heard from folks in this area. But again, with such a horrific situation, you might expect a lot of emotion. And I got to tell you, everyone's emotion has been so incredibly balanced. Everyone, from the rabbis who are coming out to talk, to the families who have spoken, to the doctors who have talked to us, and the medical professionals. It's truly been tremendous to meet the people of this community. They are a remarkable bunch. And you know, Tanya, I'm struck by the fact that the members of this synagogue, and remember, a synagogue contains multiple congregations under one roof. So at this synagogue, there were 3 different congregations that were worshiping at the time the gunman committed his rampage. It is worth noting that this synagogue had its congregants undergo active shooter training. Can you imagine that?
Oh my goodness.
These people who are Jewish have lived in fear for years, right? Long before this ever happened. And that's why they underwent active shooter training. And I can tell you from talking to one of the police officials, there is a belief within some members of law enforcement that the people who were injured and some of the people who died went into their active shooter training because the positions that they were found in indicated to law enforcement that they remembered in their head how best to get away from the gunman, right? Such as the folks who hid in that closet. There's that story of the gunman opening the closet door and not seeing more people inside the closet, right? He couldn't see them. So just incredible stories of heroism that come out. And listen, we talk about the gunman. There's no need to mention his name, but I will tell you this: he's in federal custody today. And a federal judge told him yesterday he's not getting out anytime soon. The prosecution asked that he be denied bail because they believe he is a flight risk. The judge agreed, and so he remanded him back into the custody of the United States Marshals. He is due back in court on Thursday. There is a possibility that that hearing could be postponed. He is charged with hate crimes, Tanya, that could carry the death penalty if he's convicted. But this was really interesting. Yesterday in court, he was given the option to have the judge read the possible penalties to him, and he waived his right to hear that. He told the judge, he told his attorney who told the judge there was no need to do that.
And David, prosecutors have stated that they intend to seek the death penalty, isn't that right?
That is correct. They intend to. I mean, obviously, there has to be a conviction. Now, listen, you should know that some people have been on death row even after being federally prosecuted for a decade or more. So this is something where if he were to be convicted and if he were to be sentenced to death, it could be many years before that ever happens. I will tell you another thing that struck me was when he came into the courtroom. Right, you hear a story of a man who's deranged, who's yelling "Kill the Jews" and to law enforcement, even at the hospital. And so you go into the courtroom with maybe some expectations, right, that he may be somewhat despondent or crazed looking. He was anything but. He was sitting up straight. He was in a wheelchair, but he was alert. He was curious. He kind of scanned the courtroom, looked at everybody who was there, answered. They asked him to sign some documents, and he was handcuffed, but he said, "I can scribble." And the judge asked him some questions. He said yes. He was very articulate. He projected his voice, and then they were out. And there was a New York Times article that quoted two Jewish, I believe, members of this congregation who were in the court hearing. And interestingly, they said he didn't exude the kind of villain look, if you will, that they expected, right? It wasn't what they were expecting to see from a so-called madman.
It's upsetting to know that someone who you might not expect is capable of that level of evil. David Begnaud, thank you so much for your reporting there from Pittsburgh. We will, of course, check back in with you later this hour.
You bet.
Well, with exactly 1 week to go until the 2018 midterm elections, President Trump is doubling down on his efforts to make immigration a key issue for voters. The president now says that he wants to end birthright citizenship in the United States through executive order. This would be a direct challenge to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment, enacted in 1868, states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. In an interview with Axios, the president proposed removing that right for babies of non-citizens and unauthorized immigrants born on U.S. soil. President Trump says he doesn't need a constitutional amendment to do it.
Now, how ridiculous. We're the only country in the world where a person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And it has to end.
Have you talked about that with council?
Yeah, I have.
So where in the process?
It's in the process. It'll happen. With an executive order. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah,
that's
it's
a very
exactly
interesting.
what I'm talking about.
I didn't think anybody knew that but me. I thought I was the only one. Jonathan.
Well, the United States is not the only country in the world that provides birthright citizenship. At least 30 countries, including Canada and Mexico, all grant this right. And as of now, this is just a proposal and one that comes with really significant legal questions. But it is the latest push to bring immigration to the forefront of midterms. On Monday, the administration announced that it would send more than 5,000 active duty troops to help Customs and Border Patrol agents in Texas, Arizona, and California. The president was told would-be border crossers, our military is waiting for you. Well, this move targets a large caravan of migrants from Central America, now in southern Mexico, slowly traveling to the U.S. border. And we should note, they're still weeks away from arriving in the U.S. Weijia Zhang is at the White House with more.
I'm sending up the military. When you looked at that bridge loaded up with people, that's called an invasion of our country.
In a late-night Fox News interview, President Trump touted the military's deployments to the U.S.-Mexico border.
When you look at that caravan, a lot of bad people in there, people that are in gangs, We don't want them in this country.
As part of Operation Faithful Patriot, the Pentagon is sending more than 5,200 troops to the southwest border, in addition to the more than 2,000 National Guard already deployed there, as well as military helicopters and giant spools of razor wire. The first 800 troops are focusing on southern Texas, the closest point of crossing for the caravan. Then the military will head west to Arizona and California. Regularly armed troops will be allowed to carry their weapons, but military personnel don't have the authority to apprehend illegal immigrants. Instead, they will install barriers at ports of entry, build houses for Border Patrol agents, and supply equipment. Troops will also provide flights to transport agents to areas where they are needed the most. Groups of migrants have already clashed with police on the Mexico-Guatemala border, reportedly leading to the death of one migrant and injuries to several officers. In recent weeks, the president has put the caravan on center stage of his campaign rallies, and even though it is about 1,000 miles away, he insists the time to act is now.
We're not letting them into this country.
Nancy Cook, White House reporter for Politico, joins me now from Arlington, Virginia. So, Nancy, critics all say this really, ending birthright citizenship, talk about this, is really designed to rally, motivate the base ahead of midterms. But what are the legal challenges?
Well, there's a bunch of legal challenges, and there's case law that goes back quite extensively on this, that has said that this is part of the Constitution and the challenges to it haven't gone over well. And I talked to a bunch of people in the White House to try to get a sense of how real this policy was this morning. And everyone I talked to a number of officials, both inside the White House and close to it, and they said, well, this is certainly an idea that Trump may have heard of before, and it's not something that is actually going through the policy process right now. It's not sort of something that the White House is pursuing actively at the moment, even though the president has a bunch of other things that he wants to do either legislatively or through executive order on immigration. So I think this is much more of a campaign pitch at this point in the closing weeks of the midterms.
So is this all it is then, Nancy? You're saying that, you've got the birthright citizenship, you've got sending troops to the border. I mean, we're talking mobilizing the U.S. military, active duty troops. Is this really just only for the sake of midterms?
Well, I think the president has genuinely been very concerned by illegal immigrants crossing the border. That's something that he's been concerned about for a long time and talks about privately. But I think the timing of this really shows that this is a very effective message that he sees going into the midterms. And we saw the same thing with his 2016 presidential campaign. Talking about fear and immigrants crossing the border was a key part of that closing message. What's interesting to me is that, yesterday the Trump campaign released an ad that was very much, Trump wasn't in the ad, it was a closing argument for the midterms, and it was very much focused on the economy. So I think that, a lot of people around him would like him to keep talking about the economy as the closing message, but the president really trusts his own political instincts, and I think that he sees immigration as the best argument.
I was going to ask you about that. He passed a tax cut reform. Why not just focus on the economy? Why turn it to immigration?
Well, I think that a bunch of donors and establishment Republicans definitely think that the economy is the best message. Just factually, we have a very low unemployment rate right now. Economic growth is much better than it's been in years. And I think more economic-minded Republicans feel like that is the best message. And we saw that in that ad that I just mentioned yesterday, where there was a woman who is sort of remembering what the economy was like during the Great Recession versus what it is now. And that's a very effective ad that his campaign put out. But I think that President Trump has never been a very conventional politician or even a conventional Republican, and really rose to power on these different messages about immigration, about being hard on trade, sort of these hardline policies. And I think that he thinks the best way to bring home the midterms and really help Republicans is through those types of messages.
Well, on that note of not being a conventional Republican, we heard from Vice President Mike Pence today. He was at an Axios event. He was asked about what he expects from the midterms.
Conventional wisdom says that for the party in the White House, it's hard to hold your majorities in your first midterm election. But I always tell people, I think we know what President Trump thinks of conventional wisdom, right? We understand what the historical tides are, but I got to tell you, I feel like that blue wave's going to hit a red wall come next Tuesday.
Blue wave hits a red wall. You know, when you actually look, though, at the president's midterm schedule and where he's going to be rallying at, I mean, you look at these are places that rallies in states with really tight races for the Senate, for the governorship. So has the White House given up on the House? What does that tell you sort of about the party's views of keeping the House?
Well, I think that the White House likes to present a very optimistic front, as we heard from Vice President Pence in the clip that you just played. But when I talk to White House officials, there seems to be a resignation that they likely will lose the House. The question is just by what margin. So I think at this point they're hoping that, you know, the margin, they just lose it by a few seats so the Democrats don't take back a huge margin. But I do think that they are feeling very confident about not just holding the Senate, but picking up seats there. And I think you see that from the president's travel schedule later this week. You know, he's going to places like Florida. He's going to West Virginia. He's going to places where there are vulnerable people up for re-election, vulnerable senators. And the Republicans are really hoping to, you know, win those seats, keep those seats, and keep the Senate majority. And you have to keep in mind, the Senate is very key for Republicans to hold because it's the Senate, for instance, that approves judges. It's the Senate that will do all the confirmation battles if there's any new cabinet members or any other officials that need to go through. So it's very key for Republicans to keep the Senate if they want to stay in power.
Nancy Cook, thank you very much for joining us, Nancy.
Thanks so much, Rena.
You bet.
Coming up just 1 week away from the midterm elections, President Trump steps up his support for Republicans in hotly contested red states. Plus, a dairy company faces backlash for supporting a controversial congressman. You're streaming CBSN.
Presented by Roberto Coin.
Well, in a new poll of Texas Senate race, Democrat Beto O'Rourke is closing in on incumbent Republican Senator Ted Cruz. The tightening of the race comes despite President Trump's visit to Houston to campaign for Cruz, who was his rival on the 2016 campaign trail. President Trump remains relatively popular in Texas. According to the Morning Consult's Trump tracker, Quinnipiac University polled the race at the beginning of October and found a 9-point lead for Senator Cruz. That lead has actually dropped to 5 points in the latest poll released yesterday. Joining me now is Dallas Morning News political writer Gromer Jeffers. Thank you very much, Gromer, for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.
So, Gromer, in this Quinnipiac poll that we're looking at, Congressman O'Rourke is leading by 16 points. And this is, when you're looking at it, it's among independent voters who, according to this poll, actually make up nearly a quarter of the likely electorate. What's the message that Beto is using to really reach out to these independents?
Well, it's a message of inclusion. You know, throughout his 20-month campaign, he's been telling Texas voters it doesn't matter if you're a Republican, Democrat, or independent. We can lead the nation in solving problems related to immigration, health care, you know, jobs, all of that. And so a positive message that voters have gravitated to that positive message. Cruz has been sort of negative in his approach, basically trying to scare conservatives to the poll. And when I say that, I don't mean it as a negative, but that's just the way it is. He needed to sort of motivate conservatives to get to the polls, and he's doing that by casting O'Rourke as too liberal and as a socialist. But you can tell by the Quinnipiac poll and other surveys that O'Rourke's positive message has resonance, particularly with independent voters.
When you talk about sort of scaring and getting Republicans to the polls, you look at President Trump sending 1,800 active duty soldiers to the Texas border there with Mexico to assist the Border Patrol as a way of awaiting sort of this caravan of asylum seekers trying to make their way through Mexico. How are voters and the campaigns responding to the president's move?
Well, that's a classic example, you know, of what I was just talking about. Some conservatives are motivated by it. They are afraid that this caravan is filled with evildoers and that troops are needed. But independents and Democrats and progressives see it as a scare tactic. They see it as sending troops to the border is unnecessary. And so we'll see how it plays out. Well, you know, it's interesting. You mentioned it, Rena, 9-point lead with likely voters, you know, in September, at the beginning of October. That's gone now. It's 5 points, even with a visit from President Trump. So I think Cruz wanted more from that presidential visit than he actually got.
You know, the Associated Press is also reporting there are issues with state voting machines, that they're actually changing voter selections when they choose the option to just vote straight one party all the way down. Gromer, what exactly is going on here?
Yeah, it's unclear why and how these problems are happening, but it's clearly a problem. They've been reported in various spots in the state. You know, straight ticket voting is popular here in Texas, and it's just what it sounds like. You can vote along party lines, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, in one swipe. And if that's not working properly, then you know, millions of voters can be impacted by it. So hopefully they'll get to the bottom of it and there won't be too much damage. But it is causing an uproar here in some parts of the state.
You know, we're getting the sense that voter turnout really is expected to rise in this election season. We know the Texas State Attorney General, Ken Paxton, is prosecuting a record number of people this year for voter fraud. What's really changing about how the Texas government is prosecuting these cases?
Well, you know, he's sort of following the lead of Governor Greg Abbott, who was Attorney General, but he's on steroids with it. He's prosecuted about 33 people this year alone for voter fraud. Democrats and voting rights activists say that has a chilling effect, because in a lot of cases, people were, you know, didn't knowingly violate the law, but they're thrown in that situation. And so the folks are saying that the Attorney General is prosecuting people for voting fraud as a suppression tactic. And that goes along with the voter ID law in Texas, redistricting cases, lawsuits that are winding their way through the federal courts. It's one of those things that Democrats say that Texas Republicans stay on top because they suppress voters. Republicans, however, see it as a law and order sort of thing, that the right to vote is cherished and elections should be protected. Somewhere there, though, there's a middle ground, and you have to get to. Let me just say, Rena, a Fort Worth woman is in jail for 3 or 4 years for unknowingly voting. She was an immigrant here without authorization. She didn't know that she couldn't vote, just did it, and now she's in jail.
Gromer Jeffers, thank you so much for highlighting all of this with the Dallas Morning News. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, we are now just 1 week away from midterm elections, and the stakes couldn't be higher as the Democrats look to gain control of the House and the Senate. Well, President Trump has Several rallies scheduled in the hopes of swinging the vote. In some of the most hotly contested states, his stops will include West Virginia, Missouri, and Florida. The races for Senate and governor are both particularly close in Florida. Nancy Cortez is in Miami with the latest.
Are we ready to flip Florida blue?
Florida's governor's race pits the mayor of Tallahassee against a Republican congressman from Jacksonville. Taking a page from the president, Republican Ron DeSantis has hammered his opponent on immigration in these closing weeks.
We don't want open borders in Florida. We don't want to abolish ICE in Florida. They are just way out of step with the people of this state.
Democrat Andrew Gillum has focused on health care.
We deserve to expand Medicaid and offer access to health care for over 800,000 of the most medically needy people in our state.
Three-term Senator Bill Nelson is hoping a strong showing from Gillum at the top of the ticket will help him fend off a challenge from Governor Rick Scott.
Rick Scott, for 8 years, has refused to expand Medicaid.
Medicaid was a rare topic of agreement among the 4 Florida voters we met in Miami.
Wanda, should Florida have expanded Medicaid?
I think so. I think it should have.
You know, we talk about taking care of our citizens, and one of the most important ways we can do that is to ensure the health of our citizens.
But they were divided over immigration and that caravan of Honduran migrants heading north.
There are people that are fleeing immense persecution, they're fleeing poverty, they're fleeing hunger, and they want to come to the United States.
So you're saying that they should then go ahead, break the immigration laws, come here and take over and come before the people that are waiting in line.
This caravan's like 1,000 miles away. I think it's just being used as a midterm election issue to rile up the base.
Listen, we all came, all of our ancestors came here from somewhere, you know what I mean? But they all came.
Legally.
Yes, legally, in an appropriate manner.
Florida's races for governor and senator are so close that President Trump is coming here to campaign twice between now and Election Day, once on Wednesday, once on Saturday. And President Obama is reportedly scheduled to be here as well, as early voting is already on pace to smash records.
Well, tonight, Red and Blue is live from Las Vegas. CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns sat down with Nevada congressional candidate Crescent Hardy to discuss the president's rhetoric ahead of the midterm elections.
Do you think the president holds any responsibility for the divisive kind of rhetoric going on in our political discourse?
Really, do you believe that Bernie Sanders holds any responsibility for the shooting on the baseball field, some of these other issues? You know, we can talk about how President Trump handles himself. Maybe you could handle it different, but right now I truly believe that people want somebody that's going to stand up. He fights back. And I think there's things out there that where the issues of the press really have sold him short and constantly attack him. I know he's got a different matter. I'm going to let President Trump be President Trump. I'm not going to stand in his way of what he wants to do.
Okay, so when he says the press is responsible, they're that envy of the people, how do you respond?
I'm going to let President Trump be President Trump, and I'll do the things the way I should do them, the way I believe I should do them, which might be a little different, but I think that's my choice.
And don't forget, Red and Blue will stream live from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. Red and Blue streams every Monday through Thursday beginning 5 p.m. Eastern, right here, CBSN.
After threats of a consumer boycott, dairy company Land O'Lakes says it is ending its financial relationship with a congressman who has ties to white nationalists. Land O'Lakes donated $2,500 to Republican Congressman Steve King in June. The recent revelation on social media prompted people to boycott the dairy company's products. But Land O'Lakes now says it will stop making political donations to his re-campaign. In September, the Iowa Republican stirred controversy for endorsing a Toronto mayoral candidate who embraced white supremacist views. Congressman King also displays a Confederate flag on his desk in Washington. He's up for re-election next Tuesday.
U.S. stocks traded higher on Tuesday after Wall Street fell sharply Monday following a report that the White House is considering new tariffs on Chinese goods. Both the Dow Jones and the S&P 500 have lost their gains for the year. But a recent CBS News poll found 7 in 10 Americans think the economy is in good shape, and 42% believe that it's improving. Stephen Moore co-authored a new book called Trumponomics. It takes a closer look at the administration's economic policies. He joined CBS this morning earlier.
Remember at that time, that was back around January of 2016, the Democrats didn't like Donald Trump very much, but the Republicans didn't like him very much either. They viewed him as a threat to the party. And we met with Donald Trump in his office at Trump Tower. I know you've been there to meet with him. And he was, you know, one of the most interesting things was I went into that room. I knew 14 of the other 15 Republicans running for president. The only one I had never met was Trump. And I had a very negative impression of him.
You thought he was brash and a media hawk.
Yeah, I thought his run for the presidency was a publicity stunt, frankly. And went into the room and just, he could not have been more gracious, you know, more attentive and interested and policy savvy. And we did put this tax plan together for him. And Art Laffer, who's the co-author of the book, of course, was the architect of the Reagan tax cut. And so it was a meeting that really sort of changed the direction of the country, because we did put that plan together and we got it passed, and it was a big deal.
So let's talk about the current state of the economy. Do you think that voters, that the American people are losing faith in Trumponomics?
Losing faith?
Yeah.
Oh no, I think this is such an amazing economy. I mean, when we took over, the economy was growing at barely 1.5%. Now we've seen 2 straight quarters of tremendous growth. In fact, I saw the president at the Rose Garden a couple weeks ago, and I said to him, you know, Mr. President, this is working better than we even thought it would. And he kind of smiled and said, you ain't seen nothing yet. But no, we're really impressed. I mean, today we have 7 million more jobs than we have workers to fill them. We've got the lowest unemployment rate ever. And look, am I worried about the stock market? Yes.
Well, and the latest GDP report talked about tariffs essentially dragging down growth. Do you agree that that's a problem?
You know, that's a great point.
He didn't follow your advice on that.
No, he didn't. Well, you know, sometimes he does. And when he asked Art Laffer and I to work with him, and Larry Kudlow, by the way, we worked as a team. As you know, Larry's now the chief economist for Trump. You know, we said, well, you know, Donald, we can't work for you because we're for free trade and you're a trade protectionist. And I remember he got very angry at that. He said, I am not a trade protectionist. He said, I believe in international commerce and international trade. He said, but we've got to have a better deal. You know, we've got to get tough with some of these countries.
Stephen,
let me just one quick point. I actually came around to some extent to his way of thinking. I started looking at the evidence, and Trump was right. We had lower tariffs than a lot of these other countries that we have trade deals with, and it wasn't a level playing field. And I think ultimately what he wants to get to is a level playing field.
Let me ask you, you talk about growth, but the last growth numbers were goosed a lot by spending. Defense spending is up 4.6. That's not the better than tax cut. So when you're goosing spending, you're just doing it like the Democrats.
Yeah, I don't like the government spending, and I think that's the biggest problem with the Republicans right now, is they're spending way too much money. And you're right, the defense spending was a big component. But look, consumer spending was up a lot in the last quarter. The quarter before that, business spending was up. Now, what's interesting about the consumer spending numbers, because, you know, what the Democrats are saying is it's just a tax cut for the rich people. And every meeting I had with Trump on this, he always said, I want to make sure this goes to middle-class workers. Trump does, people always ask me, what does he really care about? I think he cares about those workers in Erie, Pennsylvania, and places like Canton, Ohio, and places Rockford, those kind of working class Americans who frankly, who've always voted Democrat and took a gamble with Trump.
Yeah, but they're not. I mean, the tax cut is unpopular. Revenues are up, but not up what they would have been.
But the economy is popular, though. I mean, this gets.
But the economy is unpopular because GDP is up because of spending, not because of tax cuts.
Well, no, that's a little bit of an example. Look, it's clear that government spending is part of it, but the private sector economy is growing pretty quickly.
Well, coming up after a quick break, the search continues for the black box from the doomed Indonesian plane. Now, passengers who previously flew on that jet describe their frightening ride. Plus, Iran braces for punishing new U.S. sanctions. Iran warns the U.S. that it may end up with an even bigger problem. This is CBSN, always on. Well, President Trump is promising a controversial executive order to limit immigration. The president wants to challenge birthright citizenship for babies born to undocumented parents on U.S. soil. His proposals could stir up his supporters ahead of next week's midterms. Angelica Alvarez reports from the White House.
President Trump is preparing to challenge a 150-year-old constitutional standard that anyone born in America becomes an American citizen. The president told the political news site Axios that he plans to sign an executive order to, quote, remove the right to citizenship for babies of non-citizens and unauthorized immigrants born on U.S. soil.
Now, how ridiculous. We're the only country in the world where a person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits. It's ridiculous.
The 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War, specifically states all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. The president did not offer any timetable on when he would sign the order, which would almost certainly be challenged in the courts.
I think it's a pretty legally dubious claim, but he says, no, I've got people that say I can. And by the way, he has stacked the courts with a lot of conservatives, and I think some of his confidence might come from that.
The Trump administration is also launching a major military operation on the U.S.-Mexico border to prevent a caravan of refugees from entering the U.S. As part of Operation Faithful Patriot, the Pentagon is sending more than 5,200 troops to the southwest border, in addition to the more than 2,000 National Guard already deployed there. The president said last night he also plans tent cities to hold immigrants while they apply for asylum in the U.S. Angelica Alvarez, CBS News, the White House.
Well, President Trump has claimed without evidence that the group of an estimated 7,000 migrants poses a national security threat. The migrants say that they're seeking asylum in the U.S. and Mexico to escape gang violence and extreme poverty in their home countries and Honduras and Guatemala. Reuters Pentagon correspondent Idris Ali has been traveling with Secretary of Defense James Mattis. He joins us now from Washington. So, Idris, the military has really historically stayed out of politics ahead of elections. So why are they taking this action now? What makes this situation different?
Well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question that we really haven't gotten an answer from the Trump administration. As you know, this caravan is at least a few weeks, if not more, away from the border, and it doesn't really have an imminent threat to this country at this point in time, at least. So the question of why it's happening now and why they're sort of rushing troops to the border is a good one. Former officials and experts that we've spoken to sort of point out the fact that it's a week before the midterm elections, and President Trump really himself has made the border and the caravan a big part of this election. So they're pointing towards the politics of this. Secretary Mattis, we spoke with him on Sunday coming back from Prague, and he sort of pointed out whatever or however many troops go to the border, they're going to work within this law that requires that troops on the border don't take part in law enforcement activities and are really in support of CBP officials. So the short answer is we don't really know why it's now, but experts really do point towards the political nature of such a deployment.
Idris, I know, as you mentioned, you've been traveling with Secretary Mattis. There are some people who really believe that Mattis was going to be the one who was going to push against President Trump, would sign his resignation over this issue. Why hasn't he been more forceful?
Well, I will point out, last week when we did start hearing about, the potential for additional troops on the border, we were hearing about 800 to 1,000. And so this latest number of 5,000 is really a jump. It is a bit too early to tell why Secretary Mattis didn't push, or if he did push, how he pushed back. But at the end of the day, Secretary Mattis is a...
We want to take you now to Pittsburgh, where President Trump and the First Family are visiting the Tree of Life Synagogue, where 11 people were killed on Saturday. There you can see the motorcade entering the shot there in front of the Tree of Life Synagogue. Inside those cars are President Trump and the First Lady Melania Trump, as well as President Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump, and Jared Kushner. As you know, Ivanka and Jared are Jewish. Their children are Jewish. It must be an especially poignant visit for the First Family. Let's listen in. There is First Lady Melania Trump, and there is Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. We now have our David Begnaud. He is also in Pittsburgh, outside the Tree of Life Synagogue.
Tanya, I actually had the ability to communicate with you from here, but as soon as the president pulled up, they actually jammed our signal, and so we lost it instantly. Right behind me is what's known as the Beast, the President of the United States, about to get out of the vehicle, or it looks like he already has. He is with the First Lady, Melania Trump. We're told Mr. Trump is also traveling with his daughter, Ivanka Trump, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. From what I can tell, the President and the First Lady have just greeted the rabbi, who is the rabbi here at the Tree of Life, and they are now walking into the synagogue. We're told that Mr. Trump will light a candle for each of the victims inside of the synagogue. He will not be taken to the area where the individuals died, because that is still a crime scene, but he will go into what is known as the vestibule of the synagogue. They will spend a short time there, and then they will come outside, and we're told they will leave a rock for each of the victims, as is customary in the Jewish faith. And the rock, we're told, comes from the White House. They will also lay a single white rose in front of each of the 11 stars of David that have been placed out here. There's probably, I don't know, I'd say 500 bouquets of flowers. It's very quiet, very somber right now. As I look down the street, there's probably a dozen or so people outside the police tape who are watching. I should tell you that at the home of Fred Rogers, the beloved Mr. Rogers, there is a peaceful protest that is happening right now. At Mr. Rogers' home, we're told there are several hundred people who are there who have shown up to protest. These are people who are not in support of President Trump coming, people who are holding signs saying things such as vote, and there have been about 75,000 people, we're told, who have signed a petition which asked Mr. Trump not to come until he denounced white nationalism. I have to tell you, I'm a little surprised to see the rabbi of the synagogue here, Jeffrey Myers, and I'll tell you why. Mr. Myers initially said the president can come at any time, and then he reportedly told CNN that he got a barrage of hateful emails. He was disturbed by them, and he didn't think he would attend today because he had funerals that were happening earlier in the day. I called the rabbi about an hour and a half ago, and I said, listen, I saw the CNN report. I want to confirm for myself, are you coming? And he said, I don't have enough information to answer your question, and I didn't understand what he meant. And I said, Rabbi, forgive me, what are you talking about? It's very simple. Are you coming or are you not? And he said, I don't have enough information to answer your question. And so the call ended politely, and then boom, he showed up behind me. So I'm not sure if he just didn't want to confirm it to us, or if the White House asked him not to say anything. But he is in fact here. He greeted the president. It's very quiet right now, very silent. Members of the press pool are here shooting, and from what I can tell, it's kind of hard to see through the Beast, but it looks like the President and First Lady are still inside right now. I'll toss it back to you for the moment.
David Begnaud there in Pittsburgh in front of the Tree of Life Synagogue. Thank you so much. We're going to take a quick break now. We'll be right back with much more CBSN. Stay with us.
Python, finally!
Invasive species are pushing native wildlife and industries to the brink.
We can't have these things getting to the size that they get. At this size, it can definitely take your cat and dog. Something has to be done.
Oh my God.
You're gonna get hit. They multiply, they spawn like 3 million eggs per year. Very, very productive.
Some took them in as pets, but were overwhelmed and set them loose in the Everglades.
We got him.
Only elite hunters are allowed to go after them.
Ooh, we got one!
Woohoo! Ready, go for the grab. Ah!
My friend, after seeing the fish been hitting you in the face and jumping in the boat.
My revenge now. This is actually very, very good.
You got that on the camera?
Well, some people want to change trick-or-treating forever. A Change.org petition has more than 31,000 signatures urging the White House to move Halloween to the last Saturday of October. Supporters say that saving the fun for the weekend would make Halloween safer, longer, and stress-free. CBS News correspondent Jerika Duncan spoke with a mother who favors the change.
All Hallows Eve has become a night of frolic, where children wear costumes and run amok. Amok.
And running amok on Halloween would be so much sweeter on a Saturday. That's what tens of thousands of people believe who signed an online petition.
Guess what? You're going to take me trick-or-treating.
Not this year, Danny.
Mom said you have to.
Well, she can take you.
According to the Halloween and Costume Association, the organization that started the petition, 70% of parents do not accompany their children trick-or-treating, and 3,800 people are injured every year in Halloween-related incidents.